sirens of the Seattle Fire Department were the first thing I heard, a low, mourning wail that seemed to slice through the heavy fog of the Pacific Northwest. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, a time when the world should be silent, but for me, it was the moment my life fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. My phone had vibrated on the nightstand with a violence that made my heart stutter. It was Julian. His voice had been steady, too steady for a man whose wife had just collapsed on the kitchen floor. He told me Isabella was being rushed to Swedish Medical Center. He said the doctors were using words like metabolic failure and systemic collapse. He told me to hurry, but his tone held no urgency, only a cold, clinical detachment that made the hair on my arms stand up. I arrived at the emergency room while the rain was still misting against the glass doors. I had spent 30 years as a head nurse in this very city, and I knew the smell of death before it even entered the room. I knew the frantic energy of a trauma team and the heavy, stagnant air of a waiting room filled with grief. But when I saw Julian standing near the admissions desk, he wasn't pacing. He wasn't crying. He was adjusted his tie in the reflection of a vending machine, his face a mask of bored indifference. Beside him stood his parents, Robert and Martha Henderson. They were dressed as if they were attending a high-end charity gala, not a midnight medical emergency. Martha was clutching a designer handbag, her eyes darting around the room with a look of pure calculation. "Sarah," Julian said as I approached, his voice dropping into a practiced, somber register. "I am so glad you are here. The news is not good. The doctors say it is a rare autoimmune reaction, something they have never seen before. They are saying Isabella has less than 72 hours. 3 days, Sarah. That is all we have left with her." My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the edge of a plastic chair. 3 days? Isabella was 28 years old. She ran 5 miles every morning. She was the picture of health, vibrant and full of life. Just yesterday we had laughed over coffee about the new nursery she was planning for the future. There was no way her body was failing. Not like this. Not this fast. I looked Julian in the eye, searching for the grief that should have been there, but I found only a hollow, greedy light. "I need to see her," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I need to talk to the attending physician." "I know how this works, Julian. I have been a nurse longer than you have been alive. Rare metabolic failures do not just happen overnight, without symptoms." Julian stepped into my path, his hand coming up to block my way. He was taller than me, and he used his height to exert a sudden, suffocating pressure. "The doctors were very clear, Sarah. Isabella is in a fragile state. Any emotional stress could trigger a final cardiac event. As her husband and her legal proxy, I have made the decision to limit visitors. She needs peace. She needs us to pray, not to interrogate the staff." Martha Henderson stepped forward then, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. Her face was pulled into a tight, plastic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now, Sarah, dear, let us not be difficult. We are all suffering. Robert and I have already contacted the family attorney to ensure everything is handled with dignity. Julian is doing his best. You should go home, get some rest, and prepare yourself for the inevitable." Prepare for the inevitable? They were talking about my daughter, as if she were a piece of furniture they were waiting to move out of the house. I looked past them toward the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit. My Isabella was behind those doors, hooked up to machines, fighting for her life, and these people were standing here like vultures, circling a kill. I felt a surge of professional instinct, a sharp, cold clarity that pushed back the fog of my grief. I had seen this before. I had seen families who cared more about the estate than the patient, but never had I imagined it would happen to me. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If you think for 1 second that I am walking away while my daughter is in that room, you are dead wrong. I want to see her charts. I want to see the blood work. Julian's face hardened. The mask of the grieving husband slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a sneering, arrogant boy who had never worked a day in his life. I am her husband, Sarah. I have the power of attorney, and right now I am asking the security guard to escort you out. You are being hysterical. You are interfering with her care. Two security guards approached, their faces apologetic but firm. They knew me. They had seen me in these halls for years, but Julian held the legal papers. He held the authority. I was forced back, out into the cold Seattle morning, my heart screaming while my mouth stayed shut. I stood on the sidewalk as the sun began to peek through the grey clouds, watching the hospital windows. I knew something was wrong. My nurse's intuition was screaming at 80% capacity. Isabella didn't have a rare disease, she was being erased. By noon, I found myself standing in front of Isabella's beautiful home in Queen Anne, the house I had helped her buy with the inheritance from her father. The $2 million that Isabella's father had left in a trust for her when she turned 25 had always been a point of contention with Julian. He was a stockbroker who lost money faster than he could earn it, a man who lived on credit and the promise of a future windfall. I tried to open the front door with my spare key, but the lock wouldn't turn. Julian had changed the locks. I pounded on the door until Martha Henderson opened it. She was wearing one of Isabella's silk robes, a glass of expensive Chardonnay in her hand. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Oh, Sarah. Still here?" I thought Julian was clear. "This house is a place of mourning now. We don't need your negative energy here." "This is my daughter's house," I yelled, my voice echoing down the quiet, tree-lined street. "You have no right to be here. You are guests." "Actually," Martha said, taking a slow sip of her wine, "Julian has already started the transition of the estate. Since the doctors have given her 3 days, we are simply getting a head start on the inventory. It is much easier this way." Julian doesn't want to be bothered with these details when she finally passes. He has a very busy schedule at the firm. Now, run along. There is a nice motel near the airport that is more suited to your current situation. She slammed the door in my face. I stood on the porch, trembling with a rage so hot it felt like ice in my veins. I looked at the house, the windows where Isabella had hung handmade curtains, the garden where we had planted roses just last spring. These people were moving in like parasites, ready to feast on the life she had built. They weren't mourning. Chung was celebrating. I spent the next few hours sitting in my old Volvo, parked a block away, watching the house. I saw a delivery truck arrive. They were bringing in catering. Who orders high-end catering when their wife is dying in the ICU? I saw Robert Henderson carry out several boxes of Isabella's jewelry and her personal safe. My mind was racing. I needed a plan. I needed to know what they were hiding. As evening fell, I followed Julian's sleek black Mercedes to a high-end steakhouse downtown, a place called the Metropolitan Grill. It was the kind of place where a dinner for 4 could easily cost $1,000. I watched from the shadows of the parking garage as Julian, Robert, and Martha met with a fourth man, a man I recognized as a local estate lawyer. They were laughing. They were clinking glasses of bourbon. Julian was holding up a piece of paper, a look of triumph on his face. I crept closer, hiding behind a large concrete pillar. The air was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the sound of their celebration. Julian's voice carried through the quiet night, loud and arrogant. "To 72 hours," he toasted, his voice dripping with malice. "To the most profitable 3 of my life. Once the doctors sign off on the final papers, That $2 million trust is mine. No more debts. No more Sarah Miller breathing down my neck. Martha laughed, her voice a shrill, grating sound. And the house, Julian. Don't forget the house. I have already picked out the new furniture for the guest suite. We are finally going to live the way we deserve. I felt like I was suffocating. My daughter was in a hospital bed, her life flickering like a candle in the wind, and her husband was toasting to her death over a steak dinner. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run in there and tear the eyes out of Julian's head, but I knew I couldn't. I was one woman against a family of sociopaths and a legal system that favored the husband. I needed more than just anger. I needed proof. I drove back to my small apartment, my mind a whirlwind of medical codes and legal loopholes. I had been a nurse for 30 years. I knew how to read a chart. I knew that rare autoimmune collapses don't just happen to healthy 28-year-olds. Something was being administered to her, something that mimicked the symptoms of systemic failure. Julian was a stockbroker, but his father, Robert, had spent his career in the pharmaceutical industry. He knew his way around a lab. Just as I was about to collapse into bed, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number from the hospital. My heart leaped into my throat. Was she gone? Had they taken her already? Hello? I whispered, my voice trembling. Is this Sarah Miller? A woman's voice asked. She sounded hurried, her voice hushed as if she were hiding in a closet. This is Eleanor, from the patient records office at Swedish Medical. I worked under you 5 years ago, Sarah. Do you remember me? Eleanor, yes, I said, my breath catching. Please, tell me about Isabella. I shouldn't be calling you, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. Julian has put a total block on your name in the system. But something is wrong, Sarah. Julian's lawyers came in today to file the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate order. They brought a file that was supposed to be signed by you as the secondary guardian, but the signature looked like a bad photocopy. I checked the original records from when she was admitted. What did you find? I asked, my grip on the phone so tight my knuckles were white. There is a blood panel, Sarah, a deep toxicology screen that was ordered by the night shift resident before Dr. Vance took over the case. Dr. Vance is Julian's personal friend, and he has marked that file as private. But the resident never finalized it. It is sitting in the unsigned queue. It lists a high concentration of a synthetic neuromuscular blocker. It is not a disease, Sarah. She is being paralyzed from the inside out. My world stopped. Paralyzed. They weren't waiting for her to die. They were killing her. They were using a drug to slow her heart and lungs until they stopped, making it look like a natural collapse. And they had forged my signature to make sure no one would try to save her. Eleanor, can you get me that file? I asked, the nurse in me taking full control. I need that toxicology report. I can't print it without an audit trail, Elena whispered. But if you can get into the system, if you can get a physical copy of the unsigned file. Sarah, you have to hurry. They are planning to move her to a private hospice facility in the morning. Once she is out of the hospital, you will never see her again. They will let her fade away in a room where no one is watching. I will be there in 20 minutes, I said. Eleanor, thank you. You have no idea what you have done. I didn't wait. I grabbed my old nursing badge, the one I had kept for sentimental reasons, and a pair of scrubs from the back of my closet. I didn't have the luxury of grief anymore. I was a mother on a mission. I was the head nurse of this unit for a decade, and I knew every back door, every service elevator, and every password that hadn't been changed in years. I arrived at the hospital and slipped in through the ambulance bay, keeping my head down. The hospital was a labyrinth of shadows at night, the perfect place for a ghost to wander. I made my way to the records department, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found the terminal Elena had mentioned. My fingers flew over the keys, entering the old administrative codes I had memorized long ago. The screen flickered to life. There it was. Isabella Miller Henderson. Toxicology report. Pending signature. I scrolled down through the data. My eyes widened as I read the results. The levels of the blocker were 90% above a lethal dose for a child, but just enough to keep an adult in a state of suspended animation. It was a perfect, invisible murder. I hit the print command, the sound of the machine echoing like a gunshot in the silent office. I grabbed the warm paper and tucked it into my scrubs. I wasn't done. I needed to see her. I needed to know if she was still in there. I made my way to the ICU, using the service stairs to avoid the main nurses' station. I found Isabella's room. It was at the very end of the hall, isolated and dark. A single guard was sitting outside, but he was nodding off, his chin resting on his chest. I slipped past him, moving with the silence of a woman who had spent half her life on these floors. The room was freezing. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss and click of the ventilator. Isabella looked so small in the bed, her skin the color of parchment. I took her hand, and for a moment, I thought she was already gone. But then, I felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze. She was in there. She was awake, trapped in a body that wouldn't move, listening to the world move on without her. Isabella, I whispered, leaning close to her ear. It is Mum. I am here. I know what they did. I am going to save you, baby. I promise. I am going to bring them all down. Her monitor spiked for a second, a tiny blip of heart rate increase that told me she heard me. She was fighting. She was waiting for me. I looked at the IV drip, the clear fluid entering her vein. I knew I couldn't unhook it yet. If I did, the alarms would sound, and Julian would have me arrested before I could get her out. I needed a countermeasure. I needed Dr. Sterling. I slipped out of the room just as the guard began to stir. I made it to the elevator and down to the basement, where the pathology and forensic labs were located. Dr. Sterling was my oldest friend, a man who had seen the darkest parts of humanity and still believed in justice. I found him in his office, surrounded by stacks of files and a half-eaten sandwich. "Sarah?" he asked, looking up in shock. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "I heard about Isabella. I'm so sorry." "Leo," I said, throwing the toxicology report onto his desk. "Isabella isn't dying of a rare disease. Julian is murdering her, and I need you to help me prove it before the clock runs out." Sterling picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the results. His face went from confusion to a cold, hard mask of professional fury. "This is a restricted compound, Sarah. This isn't something you find in a hospital pharmacy. This is industrial grade." "It is Julian's father," I said. "Robert Henderson. He has the connections. They are trying to kill her for the trust fund, Leo. They have 72 hours before they move her to a place where she will never wake up." Sterling stood up, grabbing his coat. "Then we don't have 72 hours, Sarah. We have tonight. If we can get a clean sample and a second opinion from the state lab, we can override Julian's proxy. But we have to move fast. Julian has friends in high places, and Dr. Vance is in his pocket." We spent the next 4 hours in a fever of activity. Sterling used his authority to pull a fresh blood sample from Isabella under the guise of a mandatory forensic audit. I watched from the hallway, my heart in my mouth, as Julian's parents, Robert and Martha, arrived at the hospital at 4 in the morning. They were looking for Julian, their faces tight with anxiety. They were nervous. The 3-day window was closing, and they were getting sloppy. I hid in a supply closet as they walked past, their voices echoing in the quiet hall. Julian is worried, Robert was saying. He thinks Sarah knows more than she is letting on. We need to move the girl to the hospice facility in Tacoma by 6 o'clock. Once she is there, it is over. Martha nodded, her heels clicking rhythmically. Julian is such a coward. He should have increased the dose yesterday. But don't worry, Robert. I have already talked to the transport team. They are Henderson's people. No questions will be asked. I held my breath until they were gone. 6 o'clock. That was only 2 hours away. I ran back to Sterling's lab. Leo, they are moving her at 6. I gasped. We are out of time. Sterling looked at the centrifuge, his jaw set. The results won't be finalized for another hour, Sarah. But I have seen enough. I am calling the district attorney. We need an emergency stay. Just then my phone rang. Phone. It was an internal hospital line. I answered, expecting Elena or Leo's assistant. Sarah Miller, a cold, unfamiliar voice asked. This is the hospital's legal counsel. We have been informed of your unauthorized access to patient records and your trespassing on the ICU floor tonight. We have a signed statement from Julian Henderson requesting a restraining order. The police are on their way to the hospital to escort you off the premises. If you attempt to contact the patient or the medical staff again, you will be charged with a felony. I looked at Sterling. They knew. Julian had caught on. He was using the law to block the truth. They are coming for me, Leo, I said, my voice shaking. They are going to arrest me and move Isabella, and there will be nothing left to find. Sterling grabbed a USB drive from his computer and handed it to me. This has the raw data, Sarah. It isn't a final report, but it is enough for any competent investigator to see the fraud. Take it. Get out of here before the police arrive. I will stay here and stall them. I will tell them I authorized your presence for a consultation. What about you? I asked. You will lose your job, Leo. I am 65 years old, Sarah, he said with a sad smile. I was going to retire next year anyway. Now go. Save your daughter. I took the drive and ran. I made it to the parking garage just as 2 police cruisers pulled up to the main entrance. I drove out the back way, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I was a fugitive in my own city, a mother with a thumb drive and a broken heart, trying to outrun a family of killers. I parked in a dark alley near a 24-hour diner, the neon sign flickering in the rain. I pulled out the USB drive and looked at it. This was my only weapon. But who would listen to me? The police were looking for me. The hospital had banned me. Julian had the legal power. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was a retired nurse with no money and no influence. How could I stop them? Then, I remembered the phone call from the administration office, the one about the unsigned file. There was one person Julian couldn't control, one person who had been Isabella's father's best friend and the executor of the trust fund. A man named Henry Vance. No, not the doctor. Henry Thorne. He was a retired judge who lived in a secluded estate in Madison Park. He was the one who held the keys to the $2 million. If I could show him the proof, if I could show him that Julian was trying to trigger the inheritance through murder, he could freeze everything. I drove toward Madison Park, the rain turning into a torrential downpour. The streets were empty, the city a ghost town of grey stone and dark water. I reached Judge Thorne's gates at 5 in the morning. I hammered on the intercom until a sleepy voice answered. Who is it? It is Sarah Miller, I screamed into the rain. Isabella's mother. Please, Henry, you have to help me. They are trying to kill her. The gates groaned open. I drove up the long, winding driveway to the massive stone house. Henry Thorne was waiting at the door, wrapped in a thick wool robe, a look of utter confusion on his face. Sarah, what is going on? I heard Isabella was ill. Julian called me yesterday to discuss the trust succession. He is killing her, Henry, I said, stumbling into the foyer, soaking wet and shivering. He is using a neuromuscular blocker to fake a metabolic collapse. He has a DNR, and he is moving her to a private hospice at 6 o'clock to finish the job. Look at this. I handed him the USB drive and the paper toxicology report. Henry took them, his face darkening as he read through the documents. He was a man of the law, a man who lived by rules and evidence. He led me into his study and plugged the drive into his laptop. He spent 20 minutes in silence, his eyes moving rapidly over the data. "This is monstrous," he whispered, leaning back in his chair. "If this is true, Sarah, this is a capital offense." "It is true," I said, "and we have less than an hour before they move her." "Henry, you are the executor. You have the power to freeze the trust. Julian won't kill her if there is no money to be had. He is doing this for the $2 million. If the money vanishes, he has no reason to keep her paralyzed." Henry stood up, his face set in a mask of judicial iron. "I am doing more than freezing the trust, Sarah. I am calling the chief of police. He owes me a few favors from my time on the bench. We are going to stop that transport." But as he reached for the phone, the lights in the house flickered and died. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. "Henry," I whispered, my heart freezing. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. Then, a voice I knew all too well came from the darkness of the hallway. "You really should have just gone to that motel, Sarah. It would have been so much easier for everyone." It was Julian, and he wasn't alone. I could hear the heavy footsteps of Robert Henderson behind him. "You thought you were so clever," Julian sneered, the beam of a high-powered flashlight cutting through the room, blinding me. "You thought we didn't have the house bugged? We have been listening to every move you made. We knew you went to Sterling. We knew you came here." "Julian, stop this!" Henry Thorne roared, his voice booming in the small room. "I have seen the evidence. The police are on their way." Julian laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The police? The police are looking for Sarah Miller for kidnapping and hospital fraud. And as for you, Henry, accidents happen to old men in big houses all the var. A sudden heart attack, perhaps. The stress of a break-in can be very taxing on a man of your age." Robert Henderson stepped into the light, a heavy, silenced pistol in his hand. He looked at me with a look of pure, clinical detachment. "You were always a problem, Sarah. Too smart for your own good. But it is over now. The transport is already at the hospital. Isabella is being moved as we speak. By the time anyone finds you, she will be gone, and the trust will be in Julian's name." I felt a surge of adrenaline, the primal instinct of a mother cornered. I looked at the heavy brass lamp on Henry's desk. I looked at the shadows. I wasn't going to die here, not while Isabella was still fighting. "You will never get away with this," I said, my voice steady. "The truth is already out. Sterling has the data. Elena has the records. You can't kill everyone, Julian." Julian stepped closer, the flashlight beam burning into my eyes. "Watch me," he whispered. Just as Robert raised the gun, a new sound cut through the rain. The roar of a high-performance engine and the screech of tires on the driveway. Blue and red lights began to flash against the windows, illuminating the room in rhythmic pulses. Henry Thorne smiled in the darkness. "I didn't wait for your permission to call them, Julian. I have a silent alarm in this study. The moment the power was cut, the precinct was notified." Julian's face twisted in a mask of pure, ugly terror. He turned to the window, his eyes wide as he saw the fleet of police cruisers surrounding the house. "Robert, we have to go," he screamed, grabbing his father's arm. But it was too late. The front door was kicked open, and the house was suddenly filled with the heavy boots of a SWAT team. I fell to the floor, my hands over my head, as the room exploded in shouting and the glare of tactical lights. I saw Julian and Robert tackled to the ground. I saw the gun kicked away. I saw the look of utter defeat on Martha Henderson's face as she was led into the room in handcuffs, her silk robe stained with rain. But I didn't care about them. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the nearest officer by the lapels. "The hospital!" I screamed. "Isabella Miller, you have to stop the transport. Room 212. They are killing her." The officer nodded, barking orders into his radio. "Stay here, ma'am. We have units on the way to Swedish Medical." I didn't stay. I ran out of the house, ignored the shouts of the officers, and jumped into my car. I drove like a madwoman through the streets of Seattle, my heart screaming. I arrived at the hospital just as a private ambulance was pulling away from the service bay. "Stop!" I roared, swerving my car to block their path. The ambulance slammed on its brakes. I jumped out and ran to the back doors, pulling them open with a strength I didn't know I had. Inside, two men in generic medical uniforms were standing over a gurney. Isabella was there, her eyes wide with terror, her body still frozen. "Get away from her!" I screamed, lunging at the man nearest to me. He shoved me back, but he was interrupted by the sound of sirens entering the bay. 4 police cruisers boxed the ambulance in. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Police! Hands in the air!" I fell onto the gurney, clutching Isabella to my chest. I felt her heart beating against mine, fast and erratic. I looked at the IV line. They had already started the final dose. I reached out and ripped the needle from her arm, the clear fluid spilling onto the floor. "It is okay," I whispered, sobbing into her hair. "It is over. I have you. I have you." Isabella's eyes rolled back in her head, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was too late. I started CPR, my hands moving with the rhythm of 30 years of experience. 1, 2, 3. Come on, baby. Stay with me. I worked until my arms were numb, until the paramedics from the hospital took over. I stood back, my scrubs soaked in rain and blood, watching as they rushed her back into the ICU. I stood there for hours, a ghost in the hallway, until Dr. Sterling finally walked out of the trauma room. He looked at me, his face exhausted but hopeful. "She is stable, Sarah. We administered the reversal agent. The toxin is flushing out of her system. She is going to be weak for a long time, but she is going to live." I collapsed into a chair, the weight of the night finally crushing me. I had done it. I had saved her. But as I looked up at the clock, I realized the 72-hour window wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Julian and the Hendersons were in custody, but they were rich, they were powerful, and they were already calling their lawyers. The battle for Isabella's life was over, but the battle for her future was just beginning. I walked to the ICU window and looked in at my daughter. She was breathing on her own now. Her eyes were closed, but she looked peaceful. I knew the road ahead would be long. I knew there would be trials and depositions and a media circus. But I also knew that as long as I had breath in my body, no one would ever hurt her again. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and saw a missed call from the hospital administration. I called back. "This is Sarah Miller," I said, my voice cold and hard. "I believe you have a file that needs my signature." The voice on the other end was apologetic, terrified. "Yes, Mrs. Miller. We are so sorry for the misunderstanding. We have the full investigative report ready for your review. Good, I said, because I am coming for everything. Every dollar, every title, every piece of dignity they tried to steal from us. I hung up and looked at the sunrise over the Olympic Mountains. The 3 days were up, and the reckoning was here. The legal victory at Judge Thorne's estate felt hollow the moment the sun began to rise over the cold, grey waters of Puget Sound. As I watched the police cruisers pull away with Julian and the Hendersons in the back, I should have felt a sense of finality. But my nursing instincts told me the war had only shifted fronts. Money in America is a powerful shield, and the Hendersons had plenty of it, along with connections that reached into the very heart of the state's judicial system. Within 6 hours, Julian's high-priced defense attorneys had filed for an emergency bail hearing, arguing that the evidence I had gathered was obtained through illegal trespassing and unauthorized access to medical records. By noon, Julian, Robert, and Martha were walking out of the precinct on a bond that cost them less than a fraction of Isabella's $2 million trust fund. I stood in the hospital hallway, watching through the glass as Julian walked free, his face a mask of arrogant triumph. He didn't look like a man who had just been arrested. He looked like a predator who had just survived a minor inconvenience. He made eye contact with me for a brief second, his lips curling into a sneer that promised a cold, calculated retaliation. I knew then that the police wouldn't be enough to stop him. I needed to play a different game, a game that Julian and his family understood perfectly, a game of public perception and absolute destruction. Leo Sterling found me near the ICU, his face drawn and exhausted. "They are pushing for the hospice transfer again, Sarah," he whispered, leaning against the cold white wall. "Julian's lawyers are claiming that your interference has compromised Isabella's care. They've obtained a court order to move her to a private facility in Tacoma by 8 o'clock tonight. Once she's in their territory, we won't be able to touch her. The reversal agents I administered are working, but she's still too weak to speak. If they move her now, the transport alone could kill her, or they'll just finish the job in the back of the ambulance." I looked at my daughter through the window. Her chest was rising and falling with a steady, mechanical rhythm. She was fighting, but she was trapped in a body that the world believed was failing. I turned to Leo, my eyes hard with a resolve that felt like steel. "We aren't going to let them move her, Leo. But we aren't going to stop the transport either. We're going to give Julian exactly what he wants. We're going to let him think he's won." Leo frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" "Julian needs a death certificate to unlock that trust," I said, my mind moving with the precision of a surgical blade. "He needs a body. So, we're going to give him a ghost. We're going to move Isabella to a secure private wing of the pathology lab under your authority for a forensic audit. We'll tell the transport team and the Hendersons that she had a final cardiac event during the transfer preparation. We'll declare her clinically dead, but we'll keep her alive in the shadows." Sterling stared at me, the ethical weight of the plan visible in his eyes. "Sarah, that's highly illegal. I could lose more than my license. I could go to prison for falsifying a death record." "They tried to murder my daughter Leo," I said, grabbing his arm. "They forged my signature. They bribed a doctor. They are celebrating over steak dinners while she's paralyzed. If we play by the rules, Isabella dies tonight. If we play by mine, we take everything from them. I have 30 years of service in this hospital. I know how to disappear a patient. Help me save her." Sterling took a long, deep breath, looking at the silent machines in Isabella's room. Finally, he nodded. "I'll clear the South Service elevator and reroute the security cameras for 10 minutes, but you have less than 2 hours. Julian is already on his way back with the hospice paperwork." The next 90 minutes were a blur of adrenaline and clinical efficiency. With Elena's help in records, we created a phantom patient file. We moved Isabella in the dark, using a gurney draped in a heavy white sheet, making her look like a cold statistic of the night shift. We tucked her into a sterile, hidden room in the basement labs, a place where only Sterling had the key. I set up the monitors myself, my hands moving with the muscle memory of 3 decades of nursing. I adjusted her IV, checked her vitals, and whispered to her that the world was about to think she was gone, but that I would never leave her side. When Julian arrived at 6 o'clock with his lawyers and a smug, self-satisfied smile, he was met with the news. Dr. Sterling, his face a perfect mask of professional grief, informed him that Isabella had suffered a massive pulmonary embolism during the preparation for transport. He told them that despite 45 minutes of resuscitation efforts, she had passed away at 5:45. I watched from the observation deck as Julian's face went through a terrifying transformation. For a second, there was shock, but it was quickly replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated relief. He didn't ask to see the body. He didn't ask to say goodbye. He simply turned to his father, Robert, and nodded. Martha Henderson actually pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at her dry eyes, a performance so hollow it made my stomach churn. "It is a tragedy," Julian said to the hospital administrator, his voice lacking even a shred of genuine emotion. "But perhaps it is for the best. She is at peace now. We will begin the arrangements for the memorial immediately. We want it to be a grand celebration of her life, something fitting for a woman of her status." What he meant was that he wanted to finalize the trust fund before the body was even cold. He wanted a public display of his status as the grieving, wealthy widower. For the next 48 hours, I lived in the basement of Swedish Medical Center. I slept in a chair next to Isabella's bed, waking every hour to check her vitals. The reversal agents Sterling had secretly procured were working miracles. Isabella's eyes began to track movement. Her fingers began to grip mine with more than just a reflex. By the second night, she was breathing on her own, the ventilator removed and replaced with a simple oxygen mask. "Mom," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thread of sound. It was the first time I had heard her voice in what felt like a lifetime. "I'm here, baby," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm right here." "Julian," she whispered, a look of profound, agonizing betrayal crossing her pale face. "He did this. He told me it was a vitamin injection. He said I looked tired." "I know, Isabella. I know everything. And he thinks you're dead. He thinks he's free. But we're going to show him exactly what a ghost can do." Isabella looked at me, her eyes clearing, the fire that had always defined her returning to her gaze. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was a survivor who wanted her life back. "What is the plan, Mum?" I explained the gala. Julian had announced a grand memorial gala at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel for the third night, the exact end of the 72-hour window. He was calling it a tribute to her life, but it was really a coming-out party for his new wealth. He had invited the elite of Seattle, the board members of the H Group, and the executors of the trust fund. He wanted to secure his position as the sole heir in front of the most influential people in the city. "I want to be there," Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I want to see his face when I walk into that room." "You'll do better than that," I said. "You're going to let him tell the world how much he loved you first. We're going to let him dig his own grave in front of everyone he's ever wanted to impress." Sterling helped us coordinate with Judge Henry Thorne. The judge was still furious about the attempt on his life, and he had spent the last 48 hours using his own resources to dig into the Hendersons' financial records. He found exactly what we expected. Julian was nearly $3 million in debt to offshore creditors. The $2 million trust was his only way out. He had planned the murder to coincide with a major debt payment deadline. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, biting wind that whipped through the streets of downtown Seattle. The Fairmont Olympic was glowing with lights, a fleet of black town cars lining the curb. Julian had spared no expense, using the very money he had stolen from Isabella's accounts over the last year to create a spectacle of grief. The ballroom was draped in black silk and white lilies, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the hushed murmurs of the city's social elite. I arrived at the hotel an hour early, dressed in a sharp, professional black suit, my old nursing badge hidden in my pocket as a reminder of who I was. Sterling was with me, along with two plainclothes officers Thorne had arranged. We moved through the service entrance, making our way to the ballroom's technical booth. The young technician Julian had hired was easily distracted by a fake security audit Sterling initiated, allowing me to slip a USB drive into the hotel's media server. The drive didn't contain photos of Isabella's childhood or videos of our family vacations. It contained the raw, unedited footage from the Swedish medical ICU, the video Sterling and I had recorded of Isabella waking up, the footage of her describing Julian's vitamin injection, and the digital logs of the neuromuscular blocker Julian's father had procured. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine as Julian took the stage. He looked impeccable in a custom-tailored tuxedo, his face an expertly crafted mask of sorrow. He stood before a massive portrait of Isabella, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand. Robert and Martha sat in the front row, looking like the royalty they believed they were about to become. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom, his tone heavy with a practiced, dramatic tremor. "We are here tonight to remember a woman who was the light of my life. Isabella was more than just my wife. She was my soulmate. The loss I feel is a void that can never be filled. Her sudden, tragic illness has left us all in a state of profound shock." He paused, dabbing at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. "But Isabella would want us to be strong. She would want us to move forward. She would want her legacy, and the resources she left behind, to be used to build the future we always dreamed of together." The crowd was mesmerized. Several women were openly weeping. Julian was a master of the stage, a sociopath who knew exactly how to manipulate the hearts of everyone in the room. He was minutes away from the formal signing of the succession papers, which Judge Thorne, acting as a decoy, was holding in a leather folder at the edge of the stage. As I watched him, I felt a cold, calm clarity. Julian wasn't just a man. He was a parasite that had fed on my daughter's kindness until there was nothing left. It was time to cut the cord. I nodded to Sterling in the tech booth. The ballroom lights suddenly dimmed. The soft, mournful violin music Julian had selected died out, replaced by a sharp, static hiss. Julian frowned, looking toward the tech booth. "There seems to be a minor technical difficulty," he said, his voice forced and tight. Then, the massive screen behind him flickered to life. It wasn't a picture of Isabella smiling. It was a high-definition video of the Stockholm ICU room. The date and timestamp were visible in the corner, only 12 hours ago. The image was of Isabella, pale but awake, her eyes fixed on the camera. The room went deathly silent. Julian froze, his scotch glass stopping halfway to his mouth. Robert and Martha Henderson stood up, their faces turning a sickly shade of grey. "Julian did this." Isabella's voice boomed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, clear and haunting. "He told me it was a vitamin. He watched me stop breathing. He watched me go cold. He did it for the money. He did it because he is a killer." The video shifted to the toxicology report, the chemical structure of the neuromuscular blocker glowing in red on the screen. Then, it played the audio I had recorded at Swedish Medical, Robert and Martha Henderson discussing the hospice transfer and the profitable 3 days. The silence in the Fairmont ballroom was shattered by a collective gasp of horror. Julian backed away from the screen, his face twisted in a mask of pure, ugly terror. "This is a lie!" he screamed, his voice cracking, reaching a pitch of hysteria. "This is Sarah Miller. She's crazy. She's obsessed." "Sarah Miller isn't the one you should be worried about, Julian," a voice rang out from the back of the room. The massive double doors of the ballroom swung open. A path cleared instantly as Isabella was wheeled into the room by Judge Thorne and Leo Sterling. She was dressed in white, her face radiant despite her lingering weakness. She looked like a ghost that had come to claim her vengeance. The crowd retreated in a wave of shock. Julian tripped over a floral arrangement, falling back onto the stage, his tuxedo jacket snagging on a lily display. He looked at his wife as if she were a nightmare made flesh. "Isabella?" he whispered, his voice a pathetic whimper. You were dead," Sterling said. "Sterling lied to protect a patient from a murderer," Isabella said, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed room. "You thought you could erase me, Julian. You thought you could take my father's trust and use it to pay off your gambling debts. You thought my mother was just a helpless old woman who would sit in a motel and cry while you cuit-some-pan. I stepped out from the shadows then, walking onto the stage to stand beside my daughter. I looked down at Julian, who was cowering at our feet, and I felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with money or titles. It was the power of a mother who had reclaimed her child from the grave. "The 72 hours are up, Julian," I said, my voice cold and final. "But the reckoning is only just beginning." Julian looked toward his parents, but Robert and Martha were already being surrounded by plainclothes officers. The Fairmont security team, under Sterling's direction, had blocked all exits. There was no escape. The lawyers Julian had hired to facilitate the trust were already backing away, trying to distance themselves from the wreckage of the Henderson family name. "Isabella, please," Julian begged, reaching out a hand toward her. "I can explain. It was the stress. I didn't know what I was doing. Robert forced me. It was all his idea." "Julian Henderson, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Isabella Miller Henderson, corporate fraud, and conspiracy," one of the officers said, stepping forward and pulling Julian's hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I had heard in 30 years. Robert and Martha were led out in silence, their heads bowed, as the very socialites they had tried to impress looked at them with pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian was dragged from the stage, his screams of denial fading as he was led through the service entrance. The ballroom was left in a state of absolute chaos. People were talking all at once, the media presence Julian had invited now turning their cameras on the true story of the night. But Isabella and I didn't stay to watch the fallout. We left the Fairmont through the main doors, the cold Seattle air feeling fresh and clean on our faces. Sterling met us at the curb, a look of profound relief on his face. "We did it. Sarah. The hospital board is already meeting to terminate Vance's contract. The Hendersons' assets have been frozen by the DA." I looked at Leo, then at my daughter. "We saved each other," I said. Isabella took my hand, her grip firm and warm. She looked at the city lights, the grey fog finally lifting to reveal a clear, starlit sky. "I want to go home, Mum. Not to that house. I want to go to your place. I want to sit on the porch and just breathe." We drove through the quiet streets of Seattle, the sirens finally silent. For the first time in my life, I understood that justice isn't just about a courtroom or a prison sentence. It is about the restoration of dignity. It is about the moment a victim decides they are no longer afraid. The months that followed were a blur of recovery and legal proceedings. Julian and the Hendersons were sentenced to 25 years each in state prison, their appeals denied as the evidence we had gathered was deemed irrefutable. The Swedish Medical Center issued a formal apology and established a patient advocacy fund in Isabella's name. But for me, the real victory happened every morning when I walked into my kitchen and saw Isabella drinking coffee, her face full of color and her eyes full of life. We spent the summer in the San Juan Islands, away from the cameras and the lawyers. We sat on the beach and talked about the future, not the one Julian had tried to steal, but a new one, built on the foundation of the bond we had forged in the ICU. I realized then that my 30 years of nursing hadn't just been a career. It had been a training ground for the most important mission of my life. I had learned to listen to the silence. I had learned to see the truth behind the mask. And I had learned that the most powerful medicine in the world isn't a drug or a surgery. It is the unbreakable vow of a mother to protect her own. As I watched the sun set over the Pacific, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known. The Hendersons were gone. The money was safe. But more importantly, my daughter was alive. I had kept my vow. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The battle for revenge ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, steady breath. Julian's world had collapsed into a pile of debts and prison walls, but Isabella's world had expanded into something beautiful and resilient. We were no longer victims of a strange illness or a cold-blooded conspiracy. We were survivors, standing together against the tide, knowing that as long as we had each other, we could face any storm. Revenge is never about the satisfaction of a grudge, but about the mandatory recognition of the truth. Justice exists to restore dignity, not merely to destroy those who have wronged us. Family is a sacred bond, yet it can never be used as a shield for betrayal or cruelty. The most important forgiveness is the one we grant ourselves, for the vulnerability of having believed in a lie, and for the pain of having loved someone who was incapable of love in return. To truly be reborn is to walk through the fire of betrayal and emerge without losing the core of your humanity. We found our strength in the silence, our justice in the light, and our future in the simple, beautiful act of standing together.